The air in the grand dining hall of Beaumont Manor was thick with the scent of roasted meats, spiced cider, and something else, something acrid and metallic, a smell that didn't belong. It was the autumn of 1858 in the secluded hills of Cinder Hollow, Tennessee. Outside, the foliage burned with the colors of a dying sun. Inside, a celebration was turning into a horrifying tableau. The long oak table, laden with the finest crystal and silver, was no longer a symbol of union and prosperity. It was becoming a deathbed. Eleanor Beaumont, the formidable matriarch of the family, was the first. Her laughter, a sharp, commanding sound that had echoed through these halls for 50 years, choked in her throat. Her hand, adorned with a heavy gold ring, flew to her neck as her face, just moments before flushed with wine and pride, began to contort into a mask of purple-hued agony. Her eyes, wide with a terror that no one yet understood, locked onto the bride at the head of the table. The bride, Annalise, was a vision in white lace, her face as serene and pale as a porcelain doll's. She didn't move. She didn't scream. She simply watched, her expression unreadable as the great Eleanor Beaumont slid from her chair, a horrifying gurgling sound escaping her lips. The music from the string quartet faltered, a violin screeching out a single, discordant note that hung in the air like a funeral dirge. Before anyone could react to the matriarch's fall, a second gasp echoed from across the table. It was William Beaumont, the groom's uncle, a stout man known for his booming voice. His voice was gone now, replaced by a series of wet, desperate coughs. He clutched his stomach, his body doubling over with such violence that his chair scraped back, teetering on two legs before crashing to the floor, taking him with it. Then a third cry, a fourth. The wedding feast, a celebration of new life and new beginnings, was curdling into a scene of mass death, and at the center of it all the bride sat, a silent, still point in a maelstrom of macabre chaos. The guests who remained untouched stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. They were trapped in a room with a sudden, invisible plague. But this was no plague. This was something far more deliberate, far more personal. This was an execution. To understand the horrifying events of that October evening, one must first understand Cinder Hollow itself. It was a place apart, nestled deep within the rolling, mist-shrouded hills of eastern Tennessee. The year 1858 was a time of simmering tensions across America, but in Cinder Hollow, the concerns of the outside world felt distant, like the faint rumble of a storm far over the horizon. Here, the old ways held sway. Superstitions were as much a part of the landscape as the ancient, gnarled oaks that clawed at the sky. Families held onto land and grudges for generations, their histories intertwined in a complex web of loyalty, debt, and forbidden secrets. At the very center of this web sat the Beaumont family. They were not merely landowners. They were the architects of the Hollow's modern history. Their sprawling manor, a Gothic revival monstrosity of dark wood and stained glass, perched on a hill overlooking the entire valley, a constant, brooding reminder of their dominion. They had carved their fortune from the timber and tobacco of the land, and their word was law. The patriarch, Thomas Beaumont S.R., had passed a decade prior, leaving his wife, Eleanor, to rule the family with an iron will and a gaze that could wither crops. Her sons, Thomas Jr., and the younger, sickly Samuel, were the heirs to this legacy. Thomas, the groom, was a handsome, if somewhat weak-willed man, accustomed to having his path cleared for him by the weight of his family name. He was the golden child, the future of the Beaumont dynasty, and he had fallen hopelessly and completely for a woman who was the antithesis of everything his family represented. Her name was Annalise Finch, and she was a ghost, a whisper, a woman who seemed to have materialized from the thick Tennessee fog itself. She had no family to speak of, no land, no dowry. She was an outsider, a mystery that the tight-knit community of Cinder Hollow could not unravel. Her beauty was undeniable, a stark, ethereal kind that seemed more suited to a funeral parlor than a wedding chapel. It was this beauty that had ensnared Thomas, but it was her silence, her unnerving stillness, that had so deeply disturbed his mother, Eleanor. Annalise Finch arrived in Cinder Hollow in the spring of 1858, ostensibly to serve as a governess for the town physician's children. She claimed to be an orphan from a distant county, a place ravaged by cholera, leaving her with no living relatives. Her story was plausible enough, but it was delivered with a detachment that many found unsettling. It was a story devoid of emotion, a recitation of facts that felt hollow, unlived. She carried with her only a single, worn leather trunk which, it was rumored, she kept locked at all times. In a community where lineage was everything, Annalise had none. She was a blank page, and this made her both fascinating and deeply suspect. The women of the Hollow whispered about her as she walked through the town square, her posture perfect, her gaze fixed forward, never meeting the curious or hostile eyes that followed her. They noted her unusual knowledge of botany. She could identify wild herbs and fungi with an expert's eye, often wandering the deep woods alone for hours. She spoke of their properties, which could heal a fever, which could soothe a cough, and more disturbingly, which could stop a man's heart with but a single, well-placed leaf in his tea. These were comments made in passing, yet they were collected and stored away by the town's gossips, each one adding another layer to the enigma of Annalise Finch. It was during one of these woodland excursions that she first encountered Thomas Beaumont Jr. He was hunting, and the sight of her, a pale figure in a simple gray dress standing silently among the ancient trees, struck him with the force of a revelation. He was a man who had known only the carefully curated, socially acceptable daughters of his mother's friends. Annalise was something else entirely. She was wild, unknowable, a forbidden chapter in the predictable book of his life. He pursued her with a singular, desperate passion that bordered on obsession. His courtship was swift and intense, ignoring the quiet warnings from his friends and the outright, furious objections of his mother. Eleanor Beaumont saw in Annalise not a mysterious beauty, but a predator. She saw a coldness in the young woman's eyes, a void where warmth and deference should have been. She ran inquiries, sending letters to the county Annalise claimed as her home, but the replies that came back were vague, inconclusive. It was as if Annalise Finch had simply been born of the ether. The engagement was announced in late summer, sending a shockwave through the rigid social structure of Cinder Hollow. The Beaumonts, a family that prized bloodline and history above all else, were to be joined with a woman who had neither. Eleanor Beaumont was apoplectic. She confronted her son in the cavernous study of the manor, the portraits of his ancestors staring down at them with stern, painted eyes. She accused Annalise of being a fortune hunter, a charlatan, a woman of low birth and even lower intentions. She threatened to disinherit Thomas, to cast him out and sever him from the family legacy he was born to uphold. But Thomas, for the first time in his life, stood defiant. His love for Annalise had become a fever, clouding his judgment and deafening him to his mother's warnings. He saw her not as a threat, but as a victim, a lonely soul whom only he could protect and cherish. His defiance only hardened Eleanor's resolve. She began her own quiet, macabre investigation. She instructed her servants to watch Annalise's every move, to report on her conversations, her habits, her solitary walks in the woods. She became convinced that the woman was practicing some form of forbidden folk magic, a dark art learned from the isolated hill folk who lived in the deepest parts of the forest. The whispers grew louder. A stable hand claimed to have seen Annalise near the old, gnarled yew tree by the river, a tree rumored to be cursed, its needles a potent poison. A kitchen maid swore she saw the bride-to-be collecting mushrooms from the damp, shaded parts of the garden, not the edible kind, but the pale, ghostly white varietals that the elders called death angels. Annalise dismissed these sightings with a placid smile, explaining her interest as mere botany, a simple hobby. Yet with every passing day, Eleanor's dread grew. She felt an invasive, chilling presence in her home. It was as if the manor itself was rejecting this new addition, the very walls groaning in protest. She began to feel like a stranger in her own house, haunted by the quiet, watchful eyes of her future daughter-in-law. The wedding date was set for October, and as it approached, a palpable sense of doom began to settle over Beaumont Manor, thick and suffocating as the autumn fog. The wedding day dawned gray and oppressive. A low, weeping mist clung to the hills, refusing to burn off even as the morning wore on. It was considered a bad omen by the superstitious folk of Cinder Hollow, a sign that the heavens themselves disapproved of the union. Inside the manor, the preparations were frantic, yet strangely muted, as if everyone were simply going through the motions of a celebration they knew was ill-fated. Annalise was a study in contrasts. While the household buzzed with nervous energy, she was preternaturally calm. Dressed in her simple, elegant gown of white lace, she seemed to glide through the chaos, an ethereal, almost ghostly figure. She moved with a purpose that was unsettling, her actions deliberate and precise. The centerpiece of the wedding feast was to be a grand venison stew, a cherished Beaumont family recipe passed down through generations. It was a rich, complex dish, heavily seasoned with a blend of herbs and spices that was a closely guarded family secret. That morning, Annalise entered the bustling kitchen. The head cook, a woman who had served the Beaumonts for 30 years, was wary of her presence, but Annalise offered a disarmingly sweet smile. She carried a small, velvet pouch. "A wedding gift," she said, her voice a soft murmur against the clatter of pots and pans. "From my home county, a special blend of herbs to ensure a long and prosperous life. May I add it to the stew, for good fortune?" The cook hesitated. It was a breach of tradition, a violation of the sacred family recipe. But to refuse the bride on her wedding day would be a grave insult, and Thomas Beaumont had made it clear that Annalise was to be shown every courtesy. Reluctantly, the cook nodded, watching as Annalise untied the velvet pouch. A fine, dark green powder was tipped into the enormous cast-iron pot simmering over the fire. Annalise stirred it once, twice, with a long wooden spoon, her reflection rippling in the dark, bubbling surface of the stew. A strange, slightly bitter aroma, almost like almonds, briefly cut through the savory scent, but was quickly overwhelmed by the other spices. Annalise smiled again, a thin, tight smile that did not reach her cold, watchful eyes, and departed the kitchen as silently as she had entered. The ceremony was held in the manor's private chapel, a small, somber space of dark oak and stained glass that depicted grim-faced saints. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of wilting lilies and candle wax. Thomas Beaumont stood at the altar, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the chapel doors, waiting for his bride. When Annalise appeared, a collective gasp went through the assembled guests. She was breathtakingly beautiful, but her beauty was cold, sculptural, like a statue carved from ice. She walked down the aisle on the arm of the town physician, her face a serene, emotionless mask. Her eyes met no one's. They were fixed on Thomas, yet her gaze seemed to look straight through him at something far beyond. Eleanor Beaumont sat in the front pew, rigid as a pillar of salt, her face a thunderous mask of disapproval. She watched the woman who was about to take her family's name, and she felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear. It was a primal, instinctual terror, a feeling that this union was not just a social misstep, but a violation of the natural order of things. The vows were exchanged in near whispers. Thomas's voice trembled with emotion. Annalise's was clear, steady, and chillingly devoid of it. When the preacher declared them man and wife, the kiss they shared was brief, almost chaste. There was no joy in it. It was a formality, a seal on a contract that only one of them seemed to fully understand. As the wedding party moved from the chapel to the grand dining hall for the feast, a sense of dread followed them. The forced smiles and polite congratulations could not dispel the gloom that had settled over the house. The feast was a lavish, almost desperate attempt at festivity. Wine flowed freely and the string quartet played on, but an undercurrent of tension ran beneath it all. The guests ate and drank, their laughter sounding hollow and strained. And then the main course was served. Servants carried in the great tureen of venison stew, its rich aroma filling the hall. A portion was served to every member of the Beaumont family, and to their honored guests. Annalise, the bride, politely declined. "I am overcome with joy," she said, her voice just loud enough to be heard over the music. "I fear I cannot eat a bite." She raised a glass of water to her lips, her eyes scanning the table, watching as each member of her new family lifted a spoonful of the tainted stew to their mouths. The poison was not a merciful one. It was derived from the ground pits of cherries and peaches, a crude but potent form of cyanide, refined and concentrated with a knowledge of herbalism that was both arcane and horrifying. Analyze had carefully calibrated the dose, mixing it with the powdered leaves of foxglove to create a macabre cocktail. The cyanide would provide the swift, agonizing death, while the foxglove would induce cardiac chaos, ensuring that even those with the strongest constitutions would not survive. The effects began within minutes of the first spoonful. It started as a subtle warmth in the throat, a slight dizziness that most attributed to the free-flowing wine. But then came the burning, a searing, fiery pain that started in the stomach and clawed its way up the esophagus. Eleanor Beaumont was the first to succumb because she had eaten with gusto, a final act of defiance to show that she was still the mistress of this table. The poison ravaged her system with terrifying speed. Her Roman 6. Cyan blurred, the faces of her family and guests warping into grotesque caricatures. Her heart began to pound erratically, a wild, panicked drumbeat against her ribs before it fluttered and seized. William Beaumont, a man of robust health, suffered a more violent reaction. The convulsions started in his limbs, a terrifying, uncontrollable shudder that threw him from his chair. He writhed on the Persian rug, his face contorting, foam flecking his lips as his body was racked by the invisible torment. The dining hall, a scene of celebration just moments before, descended into a pandemonium of death. Cries of pain mingled with the screams of horrified guests. The string quartet fell silent, the musicians staring, paralyzed at the unfolding nightmare. Servants dropped trays, the crash of silver and porcelain echoing the shattering of the Beaumont dynasty. More bodies began to fall. Thomas's younger brother, Samuel, a frail young man to begin with, simply slumped forward, his face falling into his plate of half-eaten stew, his life extinguished without a sound. An aunt, a cousin, a trusted family advisor, all of them who had partaken in the family's signature dish, were now caught in the throes of a gruesome, synchronized death. The room reeked of bitter almonds, the telltale scent of cyanide, a smell that now mingled with the festive aromas, creating a nauseating and deeply disturbing perfume of death. Amidst the horrifying chaos, two figures remained untouched. One was the groom, Thomas Beaumont, Jr. He had been so engrossed in a conversation with a guest seated next to him, and so preoccupied with his mother's simmering rage, that he had barely touched his food. He now stood frozen, his wine glass slipped from his fingers, staining the white tablecloth a deep, bloody red. His face was a canvas of utter disbelief, his mind unable to process the macabre scene unfolding before him. His mother, his uncle, his brother, his entire world was collapsing in a symphony of agony, and he could only watch helpless. The other figure was the bride. Annalise Finch Beaumont remained seated at the head of the table, a portrait of chilling serenity. The screams, the convulsions, the sounds of dying did not seem to register on her placid features. She watched the death of the Beaumont clan not with horror or surprise, but with a quiet, intense focus, like a scientist observing the results of a meticulously planned experiment. Her composure was the most terrifying thing in the room. It was unnatural, inhuman. As the few surviving guests, those who had not eaten the stew, scrambled for the exits, their flight blocked by the writhing bodies on the floor, a horrifying realization began to dawn on Thomas. He looked from the contorted face of his dead mother to the calm, placid face of his new wife. He saw the untouched plate of stew in front of her. He remembered her strange, almost ceremonial addition of herbs in the kitchen that morning. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, forming a picture so monstrous, so unthinkable that his mind recoiled from it. This was not a tragic accident. This was not a sudden, inexplicable illness. This was a massacre. And the architect of this destruction was the woman he had just vowed to love and cherish for the rest of his life. His love, which had been a blinding fever, was now instantly replaced by an ice-cold dread. He was married to a monster. He had invited a viper into the heart of his home, and it had just delivered its fatal bite. The story of what happened at Beaumont Manor that day would become a banned legend in Cinder Hollow, a forbidden history whispered only in the darkest corners. If you're compelled by these macabre tales from the forgotten pages of history, subscribe to our channel now, because the reason for Analyze's horrifying revenge is even more disturbing than the act itself. The immediate aftermath was a blur of chaos and fear. The town physician, Dr. Albright, who had walked Analyze down the aisle, was now faced with a scene from a charnel house. He rushed from one body to the next, his medical bag useless against the swift, brutal efficacy of the poison. He recognized the symptoms: the cyanotic blue tint of the skin, the fixed, dilated pupils, the faint, sickeningly sweet smell that clung to the victims. He had seen it before, but only in textbooks, in descriptions of rare and potent toxins. He could do nothing but pronounce them dead, his voice a hoarse whisper as he listed the names of the most powerful family in the county. The sheriff, a man named Jebediah Stone, arrived shortly after, his face grim. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy, but what he saw in that dining hall defied all rational explanation. It looked like the wrath of God had descended upon the Beaumonts. But as he surveyed the scene, his eyes, like Thomas's, were drawn to the two constants, the dead and dying who had eaten the stew and the bride who had not. He found Th. Omas Beaumont slumped in a chair in the drawing room, his body shaking uncontrollably, his eyes wide and vacant with shock. When the sheriff asked what had happened, Thomas could only point a trembling finger back toward the dining hall, toward his wife, and utter a single broken word: her. Analyze was found exactly where she had been left, still seated at the head of the macabre banquet table. She did not resist when Sheriff Stone approached. She showed no fear, no remorse, no emotion of any kind. Her hands, folded delicately in her lap, were steady. Her breathing was even. She was an island of tranquility in an ocean of death. The sheriff, a man who had dealt with violent drunks and petty thieves his entire career, felt a genuine chill crawl up his spine as he looked into her eyes. They were like polished stones, deep and empty. He asked her what she had put in the stew. She met his gaze and replied in her calm, melodic voice, "A family recipe." She was taken into custody without a struggle, gliding out of the manor as gracefully as she had entered it that morning. As she was led away, the surviving residents of Cinder Hollow gathered outside the gates, their faces pale in the torchlight, their whispers following her like a shroud. They called her a witch, a demon, a creature sent from the depths of hell to destroy their town's most prominent family. They were not entirely wrong. Analyze Finch was locked in the small, damp cell beneath the sheriff's office. It was a place reserved for the most desperate of criminals, but it had never held a prisoner like her. She did not rave or cry. She did not protest her innocence or beg for mercy. She simply sat on the narrow cot, her back straight, her wedding dress now sullied with the grime of the jailhouse floor. She was utterly silent. News of the Beaumont poisoning spread like wildfire, carried by breathless riders to the surrounding towns and counties. It was a horrifying, almost unbelievable tale, an entire family struck down at a wedding feast by the bride herself. The story became a sensation, a piece of Gothic American folklore born in a single night of bloodshed. Journalists from as far away as Nashville and Knoxville descended on Cinder Hollow, eager to get the salacious details of the Bride of Cinder Hollow, as the newspapers quickly dubbed her. They interviewed the terrified wedding guests, the shell-shocked servants, and the grim-faced sheriff. They painted a picture of Analyze as a cold-blooded monster, a siren who had lured Thomas Beaumont and his family to their doom. But one crucial question remained unanswered, a question that gnawed at everyone who heard the story. Why? What could possibly motivate a woman to commit such an intimate and monstrous act of mass murder? Robbery was ruled out. Nothing of value was taken from the manor. Blackmail seemed unlikely, given the Beaumont's power. The prevailing theory, fueled by the superstitions of the region, was that she was simply evil incarnate, a woman possessed by a demonic force. But Sheriff Stone wasn't satisfied with such supernatural explanations. He believed that evil always had a root, a source. He was convinced that the key to this horrifying mystery lay in Annalise's past, in the blank pages of her history that she had so carefully guarded. He began a new, more determined investigation, sending out telegrams and letters, determined to find out who Annalise Finch truly was. He needed to uncover the forbidden truth that had been buried, a truth that had now been unearthed with such devastating and bloody consequences. He had a feeling that the story of the Beaumonts did not begin with Annalise's arrival, but had ended with it. As Sheriff Stone delved deeper, the town of Cinder Hollow turned in on itself, consumed by fear and suspicion. The Beaumont Manor, once a symbol of power and permanence, now stood silent and dark on its hill, a vast, imposing tomb. No one dared approach it after nightfall. Locals claimed to see strange lights flickering in the windows and hear the faint, ghostly strains of a string quartet carrying on the wind, the phantom echoes of the wedding that had become a funeral. The macabre nature of the crime had reawakened the dormant folklore of the region. Old tales of the Kushtaka, shape-shifting creatures from Cherokee legend said to lure people to their deaths, were revived and whispered around hearths. Others spoke of a curse, an ancient blight upon the land that the Beaumonts had disturbed. Annalise, sitting silently in her cell, became the living embodiment of these dark myths. She was no longer just a woman, she was a folk devil, a cautionary tale made flesh. The details of her life in the Hollow were re-examined, each memory now tainted by the horrifying climax. Her solitary walks in the woods were no longer seen as innocent rambles, but as communions with dark forces. Her knowledge of herbs was now proof of her witchcraft. The town physician, Dr. Albright, was plagued with guilt. He had brought this woman into their community. He had vouched for her character. He replayed every conversation he'd ever had with her, searching for a clue, a sign he had missed. He remembered her asking questions about the Beaumonts, questions that seemed idle at the time but now felt sinister and probing. She had inquired about their family history, the source of their wealth, the lands they owned. He had answered her openly, proud to share the history of the Hollow's most successful family. Now he realized he hadn't been conversing with a curious newcomer. He had been feeding information to a predator. He had unknowingly helped her map the terrain of her attack. The most disturbing recollection came from one of the kitchen maids, who, under the sheriff's questioning, remembered a chilling comment Annalise had made weeks before the wedding. While admiring the Beaumonts' ancestral portraits in the main hall, Annalise had paused before the stern likeness of Thomas Beaumont Sr. The maid heard her whisper, so softly she thought she had imagined it, "The sins of the father shall be visited upon the sons." The breakthrough in Sheriff Stone's investigation came not from a telegram or a letter, but from a man. An old, grizzled fur trapper named Silas Croft, who lived a hermit's life deep in the mountains, came down to Cinder Hollow, having heard the lurid tales of the Beaumont massacre. He was a man who rarely came to town, but the name of the bride had caught his attention, Annalise Finch. He sought out the sheriff, his eyes clouded with a memory almost 2 decades old. He told Sheriff Stone a story that had long since faded from the memory of Cinder Hollow, a piece of banned local history that the Beaumonts had gone to great lengths to suppress. Nearly 20 years prior, he said, the land that now comprised the vast easternmost portion of the Beaumont estate had belonged to another family, the Abernethys. The Abernethys were simple farmers, not wealthy or powerful like the Beaumonts, but they were respected. They had lived on that land for generations. Their patriarch, Elias Abernathy, was a proud and stubborn man. When Thomas Beaumont Sr. had sought to buy his land to expand his timber operations, Elias had refused. He would not sell his ancestral home for any price. What followed, Silas Croft recounted, was a cruel and systematic campaign of intimidation. Beaumont Sr. dammed the creek that watered the Abernathy farm, choking their crops. He fenced off access roads, isolating them. He used his influence to call in old debts, pushing the family to the brink of financial ruin. Still, Elias Abernathy refused to yield. The conflict reached its horrifying climax one winter's night. A fire, mysterious in its origin, engulfed the Abernathy farmhouse. Elias, his wife, and their 2 young sons perished in the flames. Only one member of the family survived, their 7-year-old daughter. A neighbor had found her the next morning, hiding in the woods, her face streaked with soot, her eyes hollow with a silent catatonic shock. The official verdict was a tragic accident, a stray ember from the hearth. But everyone who knew Elias Abernathy knew better. They knew it was Beaumont's fire. The little girl, now an orphan, was sent away to live with distant relatives in a faraway county. Her name, Silas Croft said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, was not Annalise Finch. Her name was Annalise Abernathy. The revelation struck Sheriff Stone with the force of a physical blow. The puzzle pieces didn't just fit, they locked together with a sickening, horrifying click. The blank page of Annalise's past was suddenly filled with a story of fire, death, and stolen land. This wasn't an act of random, motiveless evil. This was a vendetta. It was a cold, calculated, and deeply personal act of revenge that had been festering for nearly 2 decades. The name change, the fabricated history, the arrival in Cinder Hollow, it was all part of a macabre, long-conceived plan. She had returned to the place that had destroyed her family, not as a victim, but as an angel of vengeance. The sheriff now understood her unsettling calm, her unnerving focus. It was the calm of a soldier who had spent a lifetime preparing for a single battle. He looked at the case file again, and everything took on a new, sinister meaning. Her questions to Dr. Albright about the Beaumonts were not idle curiosity, they were reconnaissance. Her solitary walks in the woods were not for pleasure, they were for foraging the very weapons she would use to reclaim her family's honor. She had studied her enemy, learned their habits, their traditions, their secret family recipe. She had chosen the wedding day, a day of ultimate celebration and family unity, to be the moment of their utter annihilation. It was an act of horrifying, poetic justice. She had used the Beaumonts' own symbol of family tradition, their cherished stew, as the vessel for their destruct. Tian, she had married into their name only to extinguish it. Thomas Beaumont, Jr., the innocent son who had fallen in love with her, was not the object of her affection, but the final, crucial tool in her plan. He was her key to the castle, her means of getting close enough to the family to strike at its very heart. The love story that had captivated and scandalized the town was a complete and utter sham, a meticulously crafted illusion to mask a singular, burning purpose: retribution. The bride of Cinder Hollow wasn't a witch or a demon. She was something far more terrifying, a ghost from a past the Beaumonts thought they had buried forever. Armed with this horrifying new knowledge, Sheriff Stone confronted Annalise in her cell. He laid out the story as Silas Croft had told it, speaking the name Abernathy aloud in the small, damp room. For the first time since her arrest, Annalise's placid demeanor fractured. A flicker of something not surprise but a dark, grim satisfaction passed through her eyes. Her silence broke. She began to speak, her voice low and even, yet laced with a chilling venom that had been absent before. She did not confess to a crime. She recounted a history. She spoke of a night filled with the smell of smoke and the sound of her mother's screams. She described hiding in the cold woods, watching as the orange glow consumed her home, her family, her entire world. She spoke of being sent away, a traumatized orphan, to live with relatives who treated her as a burden. But through it all, she said, she held on to one thing: the memory of the men she saw riding away from the fire, their silhouettes stark against the flames. One of those men, she said, was Thomas Beaumont, S.R. "He took everything from me," Annalise said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every word resonated with the force of a hammer blow. "My home, my family, my name. He erased us. He thought a handful of gold and a few decades of silence could bury a crime like that. But some things don't stay buried. Some things fester in the dark." She explained her plan with a terrifying clarity. She had spent years educating herself, not just in letters and numbers, but in the dark arts of her ancestors, the knowledge of roots and herbs, of poisons that grew wild in the Tennessee hills. She had meticulously researched the Beaumont family, learning every detail of their lives. She had chosen Thomas Jr. specifically. She knew of his rebellious streak, his attraction to things his mother despised. She had fashioned herself into his perfect, forbidden fruit. He was a means to an end, she stated, without a hint of remorse. His infatuation was a key. I used it to unlock the door to his house so I could burn it to the ground from the inside. It was a confession more chilling than any scream, a declaration of a war that Cinder Hollow never even knew was being waged. The trial of Annalise Abernathy, the woman the world knew as Annalise Finch, was a spectacle. The small county courthouse was packed to overflowing every single day. The story of the avenging orphan, the bride who served death at her own wedding feast, had captured the nation's imagination. It was a tale of Southern Gothic horror, a real-life story more macabre than anything a writer could invent. Annalise stood before the court, not as a penitent sinner, but as a proud executioner. She refused a lawyer, choosing to speak for herself. When the prosecutor detailed the horrifying deaths of the Beaumont family, describing their convulsions and agony, Annalise showed no emotion. She listened as if hearing an account of a stranger's deeds. But when she was allowed to speak, she did not defend her actions in the eyes of the law. Instead, she put the Beaumont family on trial. She recounted the story of her family, the Abernathys, painting a vivid picture of the life that had been stolen from her. She spoke of the fire, the intimidation, the greed of Thomas Beaumont Sr. She turned the courtroom into a stage, and for the first time, the people of Cinder Hollow and the wider world heard the other side of the story. Her narrative was compelling, her grief palpable beneath the icy exterior. She transformed herself from a monstrous killer into a figure of tragic, righteous fury. Public opinion, which had been so staunchly against her, began to waver. While no one could condone the poisoning of an entire family, a seed of understanding, even sympathy, began to sprout. They saw not a monster but a child who had been forged into a weapon by a terrible injustice. The surviving victim, her husband Thomas Beaumont Jr., was the prosecution's star witness, but he was a broken man. He took the stand, his face gaunt, his hands trembling. He could barely look at the woman he had loved, the woman who had used that love to destroy him. He recounted the story of their courtship, his voice cracking. He spoke of her beauty, her mystery, and his own willful blindness to the warnings of his mother. His testimony was meant to paint Annalise as a manipulative demon, but instead, it highlighted his own tragic role as a pawn in her devastating game. He was as much a victim of his father's sins as anyone. The most chilling moment of the trial came when the prosecutor questioned Annalise about the poison itself. He asked her how she could have concocted such a deadly and horrifying substance, how she could have administered it to people who, whatever the crimes of their patriarch, had shown her nothing but courtesy. Annalise's response silenced the courtroom. "The land remembers," she said, her voice clear and carrying to the back of the room. "The Beaumonts thought they owned that soil, but they were merely guests. My ancestors knew its secrets. They knew which roots offered nourishment and which offered judgment. The very ground that Thomas Beaumont Sr. stole from my family provided me with the tools for my justice. I did not bring a foreign evil to Cinder Hollow. I simply unleashed the one that was already there, sleeping in the earth." Her words framed her actions not as murder, but as a form of natural, almost elemental, retribution. She had become an agent of the land itself, avenging a deep and unforgivable trespass. This mystical, almost pagan justification for her crimes was deeply unsettling to the God-fearing jury. They saw her not just as a killer, but as a heretic, a woman who communed with a darker, more ancient power. The verdict was never truly in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, and she had all but confessed. The jury took less than an hour to find her guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder. The judge, his face grim, sentenced her to death by hanging. The execution was to be carried out in the public square of Cinder Hollow, a spectacle intended to restore order and cleanse the town of the stain of her crimes. Throughout the sentencing, Annalise remained impassive. She did not plead for her life or show any sign of fear. She had completed her life's work. Her family's name had been spoken, their story had been told, and their murderers had been punished. In her eyes, her own death was merely the final, closing chapter of a story she had authored in blood. She had balanced the scales, and her own life was a small price to pay for the terrible, perfect symmetry of her revenge. The days leading up to Annalise's scheduled execution were fraught with a strange, electric tension. Cinder Hollow became a pilgrimage site for the morbidly curious. People traveled for days to catch a glimpse of the infamous Poison Bride. They gathered around the jailhouse, hoping to see her shadowy figure through the barred window. The town, which had once been a quiet, isolated pocket of the world, was now the center of a macabre circus. But as the date of the hanging approached, a strange and disturbing thing began to happen. The story Annalise had told at her trial, the story of the Abernathy family, had taken root. It spread through the hills and hollows, passed from person to person, and with each telling it grew in power. Annalise, the convicted murderer, was slowly being transformed in the public imagination into Annalise, the folk hero. She became a symbol of the downtrodden, a champion for all the small farmers and common folk who had been squeezed and broken by powerful men like Thomas Beaumont Sr. Her act of horrifying violence was reinterpreted by some as a righteous rebellion, the only course of action left to a woman who had been denied justice by the so-called civilized world. This shift in sentiment was deeply troubling to the authorities. They had intended for the execution to be a clear and final statement against lawlessness. Instead, they feared it might incite a riot, or worse, martyr Annalise and immortalize her as a legend. The night before the hanging, a thick, unnatural fog rolled into Cinder Hollow, blanketing the town in a shroud of gray. The air grew heavy and still, and a deep silence fell, broken only by the distant howling of a dog. Sheriff Stone doubled the guard at the jailhouse, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He felt as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. He visited Annalise in her cell one last time. She was not praying or weeping. She was humming a soft, quiet tune, an old lullaby he didn't recognize. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw something akin to a smile on her lips. "They can hang my body," she said, her voice calm, "but they cannot kill a story." The morning of the execution arrived, but the fog had not lifted. If anything, it had grown denser, more opaque, reducing visibility to a mere few feet. The town square where the gallows had been erected was a ghostly, shrouded space. The crowd that had gathered was a collection of indistinct shapes, their faces obscured by the thick, clinging mist. It was a scene straight from a macabre painting, the atmosphere thick with a dreadful anticipation. Sheriff Stone and his deputies went to Annalise's cell to retrieve her. They unlocked the heavy iron door, their lanterns cutting a weak, yellow path into the gloom. The cell was empty. The small, barred window at the back of the cell, a window that was barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through, was bent and broken, the iron bars twisted outward as if by some incredible, inhuman force. Annalise Abernathy had vanished. Panic and disbelief erupted. How could a woman, locked in a secure cell, simply disappear? The guards swore no one had entered or left the jailhouse all night. They had heard no sounds of a struggle, no hint of a jailbreak. It was as if she had dissolved into the very fog that now choked the town. The search was immediate and frantic. Deputies and townsmen fanned out, plunging into the misty streets and the surrounding woods, their voices calling out, muffled and quickly swallowed by the fog. They found no tracks, no sign of her passage. It was as if the earth had opened up and reclaimed her. The theories began instantly. Some claimed she had help, that sympathizers who saw her as a hero had broken her out under the cover of the fog. Others, their voices hushed with superstitious terror, insisted it was witchcraft. They believed she had dematerialized, using the dark powers they had always suspected she possessed to escape her mortal fate. She had returned to the shadows, to the deep woods from whence she came. The empty gallows stood in the center of the square, a monument to a justice that had been thwarted, a final, chilling act in a story that refused to end. Annalise had cheated the hangman, leaving behind nothing but a cold cell, a banned history brought to light, and a town that would forever be haunted by her name. What became of Thomas Beaumont Jr.? He was the last of his line, the sole survivor of a dynasty that had been annihilated in a single evening. He inherited the vast, empty manor, the sprawling lands, and a fortune now stained with the blood of his entire family. But he was a man hollowed out, a ghost rattling around in the shell of his former life. He shut himself away in Beaumont Manor, refusing all visitors. The great house, once a hub of social activity, became a place of silence and mourning. The townsfolk would see him sometimes, a gaunt figure walking the grounds at dusk, always alone. He was tormented by the two irreconcilable truths of his life. He had loved Analyze with a consuming passion, and she had been the architect of his complete and utter ruin. He was a living paradox, a man forever married to his own destruction. His love had been a lie, a carefully manipulated tool, yet the feelings he had felt were real. This knowledge was a poison far slower but just as potent as the one Analyze had served at their wedding feast. It ate away at him day by day. He was a pariah in Cinder Hollow. Though he was a victim, he was also inextricably linked to the massacre. He wore the Beaumont name, a name now synonymous with both historical crime and recent tragedy. He was a reminder of the dark secrets the town now wished to forget. Some whispered that he was slowly going mad, driven insane by grief and isolation. Servants who quit their posts at the manor spoke of hearing him talk to himself for hours, sometimes pleading, sometimes raging, as if arguing with a phantom that was always by his side. They said he kept his dead wife's room exactly as she had left it, a pristine, untouched shrine to the woman who had destroyed him. He lived this way for 5 years, a prisoner in his own home, haunted by the ghosts of both the family he had lost and the woman he had loved. He was the final victim of Analyze's revenge, his life a long, drawn-out postscript to the massacre she had orchestrated. His end was as quiet and lonely as his life had become. He was found one morning in his study, having taken his own life, finally extinguishing the last ember of the Beaumont name. The disappearance of Analyze Abernathy became the defining legend of Cinder Hollow. In the absence of a body or any evidence of her fate, stories and myths rushed in to fill the void. She became less a woman and more a force of nature, a spectral figure woven into the fabric of the local landscape. For generations, she was the monster parents used to frighten their children, the poison bride, who would snatch them away if they wandered too close to the woods after dark. One of the most persistent legends claimed that she had returned to the deep wilderness, living as a hermit, a wild woman of the hills. Trappers and hunters would sometimes report seeing a fleeting figure in the distance, a pale woman with dark hair moving silently through the trees, only to vanish when they got closer. They would find strange, intricate carvings on trees near the old Abernathy land, and small, carefully arranged bundles of poisonous herbs left on rocks. They believed she was watching over her ancestral home, a vengeful guardian, and spirit bound to the soil. Another, more disturbing story suggested that she had never left Cinder Hollow at all. This version of the tale claimed she was taken in by a small, isolated community of hill folk, people who lived by their own laws and had a deep-seated hatred for powerful landowners like the Beaumonts. They saw her not as a murderer, but as a hero who had delivered a just and righteous blow against their common enemy. They hid her, protected her, and made her one of their own. This rumor was particularly unsettling for the people of the town, as it suggested that the monster was not a distant ghost, but a living, breathing presence, hidden just beyond the edge of their civilized world, perhaps even watching them. These are the kinds of macabre cold cases that linger in the shadows of history, the ones we are dedicated to unearthing. If you don't want to miss the horrifying truths we expose, make sure you've clicked that notification bell and become part of our historical investigations. The Beaumont Manor stood as a testament to the tragedy. After Thomas J.R.'s death, the estate fell into a complicated legal battle as there were no direct heirs. Distant relatives made claims, but no one wanted to live in the house. It was seen as cursed, a place tainted by a sorrow so profound it had soaked into the very wood and stone. For years it stood abandoned, its windows boarded up, its magnificent gardens choked with weeds. The locals called it the Poison House, and it became a place of morbid fascination and dread. Teenagers would dare each other to spend a night within its decaying walls, returning with stories of ghostly whispers, the scent of bitter almonds, and the faint, heartbreaking sound of a violin playing a funeral dirge. The house became a physical manifestation of the band Beaumont history, a rotting monument to a family that had built its fortune on a foundation of sin and had paid the ultimate price. Eventually, nearly a century later, the structure was deemed unsafe and was torn down, but the legend persisted that nothing would ever grow on the spot where the dining room once stood. The soil, they said, was permanently poisoned, forever rejecting any new life. The story of Annalise and the Beaumonts became a cautionary tale, a dark piece of American folklore that served as a grim reminder. It was a story about how the past is never truly dead, how grievances can fester for generations, and how justice, when denied by man, can sometimes find a more terrible and patient agent to carry out its will. Annalise Abernathy, whether she died at the hands of a mob, escaped to the wilderness, or simply vanished into thin air, had achieved a form of horrifying immortality. She had succeeded in not only destroying the Beaumont family, but also in replacing their legacy with her own. The history of Cinder Hollow would no longer be the story of the powerful Beaumonts. It would forever be the story of the bride who served them death. Let us re-examine the psychology of Annalise Abernathy, for it is here that the true horror of the story resides. Her actions were not born of a sudden, passionate rage. They were the product of a long, slow, and meticulous cultivation of hatred. Imagine the life of the young Annalise after the fire. A 7-year-old child robbed of her entire world in a single night of terror. She is sent to live with relatives who likely see her as little more than a mouth to feed, a constant, silent reminder of a tragedy they would rather forget. In this environment of neglect and unspoken grief, her trauma would not have healed. It would have calcified, hardening into a singular, all-consuming purpose. She would have nurtured her memory of the fire, keeping it alive in the cold loneliness of her new life. Every hardship, every slight, would have added fuel to this burning core of vengeance. Her intellectual and emotional development would have been completely subsumed by this one goal. Her study of botany, particularly toxicology, was not an academic pursuit. It was the dedicated training of an assassin. She would have learned to suppress all other emotions, empathy, love, pity, as they were weaknesses that could compromise her mission. The woman who arrived in Cinder Hollow was not truly a woman at all. She was a vessel, an instrument of a vengeance that had been honed for nearly 2 decades. Her ability to feign love for Thomas, to smile and exchange pleasantries with the very people she intended to slaughter, speaks to a level of psychological control that is deeply disturbing. It suggests a complete dissociation from normal human feeling. She was playing a role in a play that she had written, directed, and would ultimately conclude with a stage littered with corpses. This transformation, from a traumatized child into a cold, efficient angel of death, is perhaps the most macabre element of the entire saga. It is a testament to the horrifying power of a grievance left to fest. In the darkness of a broken mind. Consider the role of the community in this tragedy. Cinder Hollow was a place built on a strict social hierarchy and a collective, willful amnesia. The story of the Abernathy family's demise was not a secret known only to the hermit Silas Croft. It was an open secret, a piece of forbidden knowledge that many of the older residents possessed but chose to ignore. They knew, or at the very least strongly suspected, that Thomas Beaumont S.R. was responsible for the fire that cleared the way for his estate's expansion. But the Beaumonts brought prosperity. They employed half the town. Their power was absolute. To speak out against them, to demand justice for the Abernathys, would have been social and economic suicide. So they chose silence. They became complicit in the crime through their inaction. This collective silence created the fertile ground in which Annalise's plan could grow. When she arrived, an unknown woman with a blank past, no one with the power to do so dared to dig too deep, lest they unearth the uncomfortable truths they had all agreed to bury. Their silence was a form of cowardice, and it made them unwitting accomplices to the horrifying events that followed. Annalise's revenge, therefore, was not just on the Beaumont family. It was an indictment of the entire town. The Wedding Feast Massacre was a horrifying spectacle that forced everyone in Cinder Hollow to confront the rot at the foundation of their community. She held up a mirror to them, a mirror smeared with blood, and showed them the monstrous consequences of their silent complicity. The fear and superstitious terror that gripped the town after the poisonings were not just a reaction to the violence. It was the manifestation of a deep, collective guilt. They feared Annalise was a witch or a demon because it was easier than admitting she was a human consequence, a monster of their own making. They had allowed a great evil to go unpunished, and in doing so, they had summoned an even greater one to correct the balance. The method of murder itself warrants a closer, more disturbing examination. The choice of poison was deeply symbolic. Annalise didn't use a gun or a knife, instruments of swift, passionate violence. She chose poison, the weapon of the powerless, the disenfranchised. It is a weapon that requires intimacy, deception, and a terrifying patience. It mimics illness, turning the body against itself from the inside out. By placing the poison in the Beaumonts' most cherished family dish, she was performing a profoundly symbolic act. She was corrupting their legacy at its source, turning their tradition of nourishment and unity into an agent of death and dissolution. The venison stew, a symbol of the Beaumonts' mastery over the land and its creatures, became the very thing that laid them low. It was a meal seasoned with history. Furthermore, the use of cyanide and foxglove, substances derived directly from the earth, reinforced her narrative that she was an agent of the land itself. She didn't import a weapon, she foraged for it on the very soil the Beaumonts had stolen. This adds a layer of eco-horror to the tale, as if the landscape itself was exacting its revenge through its chosen human vessel. The act of watching them eat, of sitting calmly at the head of the table while her poison did its work, is the pinnacle of this cold, calculated vengeance. It was not enough for her to kill them. She needed to bear witness to their end. She needed to see the life drained from the eyes of the family that had destroyed hers. This was not just about death. It was about reclamation. In that moment, as the matriarch Elinor choked and fell, Annalise was no longer the powerless orphan. She was in complete control, the silent god of her own horrifying creation, presiding over the table where the sins of the past were finally being paid for in the most agonizing way imaginable. Let's analyze the character of Thomas Beaumont Jr. more deeply. He is, in many ways, the most tragic figure in this story, aside from Annalise herself as a child. He was not his father. By all accounts, he was a gentler man, perhaps naive and weak-willed, but not malicious. He was innocent of the original crime that set this entire tragedy in motion. His only sin was his name. He was born a Beaumont, and for Annalise, that was an unforgivable, hereditary stain. Her ability to manipulate his genuine affection for her is a testament to her chilling capacity for deception. She would have had to perform love, day in and day out. She would have had to endure his touch, listen to his dreams for their future, and accept his ring, all while knowing she was leading him and his entire family to their graves. This required a level of emotional detachment that is almost impossible to comprehend. For Thomas, Annalise represented an escape from the stifling expectations of his mother and his family name. He saw her as an exotic, mysterious creature who could lead him to a more authentic life. The irony is devastating. In trying to escape the legacy of his family, he ran directly into the arms of the one person who would ensure that legacy ended in the most brutal way imaginable. His love was the key that unlocked the door for the monster, and he handed it over willingly, even eagerly. His survival of the initial poisoning was not an act of mercy on Annalise's part. It was arguably the cruelest part of her plan. She left him alive to witness the full scope of her revenge, to understand the depth of her deception, and to live with the knowledge that his love was the catalyst for his family's annihilation. His eventual suicide was the final, delayed casualty of the wedding feast, the last Beaumont life claimed by a crime committed before he was even born. He was a ghost long before he died, haunted by a love that was a lie and a legacy that was his death sentence. The legend of Annalise's escape from the jailhouse is a crucial component of her transformation from a criminal into a mythological figure. The official explanation, that she was broken out by sympathizers, is the most logical. However, it lacks the dark poetry that defines the rest of her story. The alternative, that she simply vanished through supernatural means, is what has allowed the tale to endure with such chilling power. The detail of the impossibly bent iron bars is key. It suggests a force beyond normal human strength, lending credence to the idea that Analyze was something more than human. Whether this detail was an exaggeration that grew over time or a deliberate fabrication by a sheriff who needed to explain his own incompetence, it served to elevate Analyze into the realm of the uncanny. The fog is another essential element. It acts as a supernatural curtain, descending upon the stage of Cinder Hollow to conceal the final act of its protagonist. It is both a literal and metaphorical obscuring of the truth. By disappearing into the fog, Analyze dissolves from a woman of flesh and blood into an idea, a ghost, a permanent and irresolvable mystery. This lack of resolution is what makes the story so deeply unsettling. If she had been hanged, her story would have had a clear moral conclusion. The killer is brought to justice, but her vanishing act denies us this closure. It leaves the possibility that she is still out there, that her brand of terrible, patient justice cannot be contained by mortal laws. It suggests that when a crime is great enough, it can conjure a response that operates outside the normal rules of the world. Her escape ensures that she is never truly defeated. She wins. She destroys her enemies, tells her story, and then melts back into the shadows, leaving a legacy of fear and a legend that will outlive everyone. The tale of the Bride of Cinder Hollow can be seen as a macabre fable about the nature of American history itself. The Beaumonts represent the powerful, the conquerors, the builders of dynasties who often construct their legacies upon forgotten crimes and buried bodies. They are the writers of the official history, the one that is celebrated in town squares and recorded in county ledgers. Their manor on the hill is a symbol of this established, dominant narrative. The Abernethys, on the other hand, represent the erased, the dispossessed, the silenced victims whose stories are plowed under by the relentless march of progress. They are the footnotes and the forgotten casualties, the ghosts that haunt the periphery of the official record. Analyze is the return of this repressed history. She is the ghost who comes back, not as a faint whisper, but as a destructive, corporeal force. Her revenge is an act of violent historical revisionism. She does not simply want to correct the record. She wants to burn the official record to the ground and replace it with her own, written in the blood of her oppressors. The story taps into a deep, unsettling truth about the foundations of many great fortunes and established communities. It suggests that beneath the manicured lawns and proud facades, there often lie stories of theft, violence, and injustice. Analyze is the terrifying embodiment of this historical debt come due. She is a reminder that the past is not a static, settled thing, but a living, breathing entity that can lie dormant for years before rising up to demand a horrifying reckoning. Her story is a banned history made manifest, a testament to the idea that what is violently suppressed will eventually return with equal and terrifying violence. Let us consider the final chilling artifact of this story, the legend itself. After the bodies were buried and the manor fell to ruin, all that was left was the tale. This story became the true and lasting legacy of both the Beaumonts and the Abernethys. It is a story that has likely been embellished over the years, with each generation adding its own layer of superstitious dread and Gothic detail. The impossibly bent R's, the ghostly violin music, the patch of ground where nothing will grow. These are the hallmarks of folklore, details that may or may not be true but are essential to the story's power. In a sense, Analyze achieved her ultimate goal not with poison but with narrative. She wanted to replace the Beaumont story with her family's story. In the end, she did more than that. She replaced it with her story. She became the central character, the dark star around which all other details orbit. The Beaumonts are now just a collection of victims, the faceless enablers of her horrifying drama. Thomas Jr. is the tragic lover. Her own family, the Abernethys, are the ghostly motivation. But Analyze is the legend. This is the final, and perhaps most profound, victory in her war. She understood that true immortality is not found in bloodlines or on headstones, but in the stories that are told in the dark. She orchestrated a crime so shocking, so perfectly symbolic, that it guaranteed its own retelling. She transformed her personal quest for vengeance into a permanent piece of American mythology. The Bride of Cinder Hollow is no longer just a historical figure. She is a campfire story, a ghost story, a piece of cultural DNA that warns of the dark potential of memory and revenge. She has become eternal, a chilling whisper on the Tennessee wind. One must wonder about the psychological toll on the survivors of that night, not the Beaumonts, but the wedding guests who ate the untainted food. Imagine being at a celebration, surrounded by laughter and music, only to watch in helpless horror as half the room dies in agony around you. The trauma of such an event would be unimaginable. These individuals would have carried the scars of that night for the rest of their lives. They would have been haunted by the sounds, the sights, the smell of bitter almonds. Every wedding they attended thereafter would have been a potential trigger, every shared meal a source of deep-seated anxiety. They became the unwilling witnesses to a history they never should have seen. Their testimony was crucial in convicting Analyze, but what was the cost? They were forced to relive the horror on the witness stand, to describe the contorted faces of their friends and neighbors. And afterward, they had to return to Cinder Hollow, a town that was now defined by this single, macabre event. They would have been unable to escape the story. Their own lives would have become secondary to the grand, dark narrative of the poisoned bride. They are the forgotten victims of Analyze's revenge. Her focus was so absolute on the Beaumont clan that these other individuals were mere collateral damage, their lifelong trauma an insignificant byproduct of her grand design. Their terror serves as a stark reminder of the indiscriminate nature of such all-consuming vengeance. When a fire is set to burn down a single house, the flames often spread to the innocent homes nearby. Analyze's fire was no different. It consumed the Beaumonts, but its heat scarred an entire community, leaving behind a generation of people who would forever be afraid of the dark. The story of Analyze Abernathy serves as a chilling exploration of the concept of justice. The legal system failed the Abernathy family. Their deaths were swept under the rug in the name of power and profit. When the official channels of justice are corrupted or inaccessible, what is a victim to do? Analyze's answer to this question is terrifying. She posits that if legal justice is unattainable, then a more ancient, elemental form of justice must be sought. Her actions operate on a brutal Old Testament logic, an eye for an eye, a family for a family. She did not seek legal restitution or an official apology. She sought annihilation. She became her own judge, jury, and executioner not just for Thomas Beaumont S.R., but for his entire bloodline. Her actions force us to confront an uncomfortable question. Can an act of profound evil ever be considered just? From a legal and moral standpoint, the answer is unequivocally no. The murder of innocent people, including the frail Samuel and the besotted Thomas Jr., is an unforgivable crime. But from the perspective of pure, raw, emotional retribution, her actions possess a horrifying symmetry. She visited upon the Beaumonts the same familial destruction that their patriarch had visited upon hers. She did not just kill them, she erased their line from the earth, just as her line had been erased. This does not excuse her actions, but it places them in a context that is far more complex than simple, motiveless evil. She represents a perversion of justice, a dark reflection of what can happen when the scales are so imbalanced that the only way to right them is to shatter them completely. Her legacy is a disturbing testament to the idea that a cry for justice, when ignored for too long, can curdle into a scream for blood. Let us speculate for a moment on a different ending. What if Thomas Beaumont Jr. had heeded his mother's warnings? What if he had rejected Analyze, choosing his family's legacy over the mysterious woman from the woods? Analyze's plan was intricate, but it was also highly contingent on her successful seduction and marriage to Thomas. Had he turned her away, her path to the heart of the Beaumont family would have been blocked. Would she have given up? It seems highly unlikely. A woman with such a singular, deeply ingrained purpose would not be so easily deterred. She would have simply devised another plan. Perhaps it would have been less poetic, less symbolic. A fire in the night, mirroring the one that destroyed her own family. A series of accidents befalling the Beaumonts one by one. The horror of the wedding feast was her masterwork, an opera of revenge, but had that stage been denied her, she would have undoubtedly settled for a simpler, cruder form of violence. The chilling truth is that from the moment she set her sights on Cinder Hollow, the Beaumonts were already dead. They just didn't know it. The wedding was not the beginning of their end. It was merely the grand finale of a hunt that had been underway for years. This perspective makes her even more terrifying. She was not just a reactive force, but a proactive, relentless predator. Her intelligence and patience were her greatest weapons. The citizens of Cinder Hollow thought the danger began when she married into the family, but the reality is far more disturbing. The danger began the moment she learned to identify the first poisonous root in the forest, the moment the traumatized little girl decided that mourning was not enough, and that only blood could wash away the ashes of her past. Ultimately, the story of the poisoned bride is a story about memory. It is about how personal memory, when suffused with trauma and injustice, can become a weapon. Annalise's memory of the fire was the core of her entire being. It was the engine that drove her every action for 2 decades. It was a memory she refused to let fade, a wound she deliberately kept open and raw. But the story is also about collective memory. The town of Cinder Hollow chose to forget the crime against the Abernethys. Their collective amnesia was a survival mechanism, a way to maintain social order and coexist with a powerful, dangerous family. They buried the memory, hoping it would decay and disappear. Annalise's horrifying act was a violent exhumation. She dug up the corpse of that buried memory and placed it on the Beaumonts' wedding table for all to see. She forced the community to confront the truth they had chosen to forget, and she did it in a way that ensured it would never, ever be forgotten again. Her legacy is a scar on the collective memory of the town. She burned her story and her family's story into their history with the acidic poison of her revenge. Long after the names of the individual Beaumonts have faded, the image of the serene bride presiding over a feast of death remains. It is a permanent, indelible stain, a testament to the fact that memory can be patient, and when it finally awakens, it can be monstrous. The tale serves as a grim warning to all who believe that the past can be easily controlled, or that the stories of the dead can be silenced forever. So what is left in Cinder Hollow today? The town still exists, a quiet place nestled in the hills of Tennessee. The story of Annalise Abernathy is no longer a forbidden secret, but its most famous, if macabre, piece of heritage. There are no monuments to the Beaumonts. Their manor is gone, their name all but forgotten except in connection to their own demise. But the legend of the poisoned bride endures. It is told by tour guides in the old town square where the gallows once stood. It is whispered in the local taverns. Her ghost is said to wander the woods where the Abernathy farm once was. Whether Annalise died shortly after her escape or lived to a ripe old age, hidden away from the world, is irrelevant. Her victory was absolute. She sought to have her family's story remembered, and in the end, her act of terrible vengeance ensured it became a dark, immortal legend. She remains an enigma, a victim, a monster, a folk hero, an avenging angel. She is a reminder that history is not always written by the victors, but sometimes by the most patient, the most ruthless, and the most haunted of its survivors. And as the mist rolls down from the Tennessee hills on a cool autumn evening, it's not hard to imagine her still out there. A silent, watchful presence, a ghost born from a forgotten fire, forever bound to the land she fought to reclaim, her whispered story a permanent, chilling fixture of the American darkness.